So I think for everybody that I know who is in business for themselves, when you're trying to commit to playing full out, what it means is that you have to have the energy to go out into the world and do that and serve that purpose that we're here to serve for ourselves and our families and the world. I think a lot of people, when we hear that concept, like I have to have the energy, we think like, okay, down another latte or, another matcha latte or whatever, or get into workaholic mode and really like push harder, push, push, push. And if we do that at the exclusion of our body's needs, we can, actually have the opposite effect and drive ourselves into the ground. And what winds up happening is that, we get so far away from that original vision and passion of, why are we doing this in the first place? Because we don't have the vitality we need to really live in, that zone of our creative genius as much of the time as possible so that we can, make the biggest contribution to the world that we can. But, as importantly, so that we, going back to that concept of enjoying the journey, so that we can actually feel the success and the pleasure of having, built what we've built and accomplished what we accomplished.
This is the Entrepology Podcast. The podcast where we optimize the bodies, brains, and lifestyles of entrepreneurs, go-getters, and world-changing innovators.
Welcome to the Entrepology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Walker. As a naturopathic doctor and anthropologist, I optimize the health and performance of badass women working to change the world as entrepreneurs and go-getters. People exactly like you. Your business, body, balance, and inner badass. These are the themes we are exploring. Well, it was a pleasure today to welcome Brie Wieselman to the show. Brie is a health coach. She has studied TCM and she is massively passionate about helping women achieve optimal health so they can go do kick-ass things in the world. Today, we talked about two primary pillars in Brie's practice, and that is digestive health and hormones. We got really deep into why you can't have a state of hormonal optimization without healthy digestion and how you can't have healthy digestion unless your hormones are in balance. Often we see these two things misaligned for women, and they are something that can get in front of and in the way of their health over and over again. We got totally real on why your business is likely causing your hormonal issues, and we unpacked it by looking at how you can start to achieve optimal digestive health, what normal even looks like, and what you need to have in place to experience, wait for it, hormonal bliss. Brie is full of wisdom. She's got a ton of experience, and she shares with us all sorts of interesting tidbits that she's picked up along the way from her virtual clinic. It is my true pleasure to introduce to you Brie Wieselman. Brie Wieselman, welcome to the Entrepology Podcast.
Thanks, Megan. So glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to jump into today's topic. And we were chatting a few minutes before we got started about burnout and hormones and digestive health, which are all your realms of expertise. But before we do that, can you give everyone a background on who you are and your journey as a healthcare provider and advocate and as an entrepreneur yourself?
Sure. Would you like me to talk about my story and kind of how I got into that? Or
I totally want your story.
All right, great. Well, so I would say it really started from birth. I had a really traumatic birth situation. And as a result, that plus genetics, I wound up being pretty sick as a kid. I had really severe asthma. And the best that they had to offer me at the time was to basically, keep me alive using a lot of different drugs. So I was on multiple medications daily pretty much until I was about 10 years old when things started to kind of improve. And then along with that, it was just clear that my immune system was constantly being challenged because I thought it was normal to get sick maybe, 4 times a winter and just catch every cold or flu that went by. So fast forward a bunch of years, and what happened was that I also went through in my teen years and actually preteens eating disorders that ironically kind of helped my asthma improve because I was cutting out, I didn't understand this at the time, but I was cutting out foods that also happened to be triggering my immune system. But the end result was that by the time, after all of this, by the time I was in my late teens and early 20s, I was kind of a bit of a mess, While my asthma had improved, for the most part, I was just hormonally out of balance. I, had a very delayed onset to my period, and then it was highly irregular. I had clear skin my whole teens, but then I started to really break out in my early 20s out of nowhere. I had started to just put on a little bit of weight out of, without really understanding why that was happening. And ultimately, I also started to have anxiety and panic attacks. So I just wasn't feeling vital. And around that same time, I had started to get interested in natural health just because after going through what I had been through with all the medications and learning, hey, we have these plants and, nutrients play a role, and there's all these things we can do that are, natural, that work with the body as opposed to overriding the body. I realized that, had my physicians and caretakers known about these things when I was young, that there would have been so many more options, and maybe some of the negative side effects of all of those medications could have been avoided. So I dove deep into that study and started with herbal medicine, and then eventually, years later, went to school for traditional Chinese medicine, which is my medical degree, and from there also functional medicine. And throughout these studies, I was able to improve my health, by learning more about nutrition and different, acupuncture, herbs, and lifestyle. But there was, I was also exhausted and totally burned out, and I was constantly kind of wired and tired and anxious. I started to develop really bad insomnia, and so there was all these areas that were improving, and then there were these areas that were getting worse. And frankly, by the time I had gone through my master's degree and was trying to, start my business, I was just feeling terrible. And so as a result, I just really, a couple years in, I stopped and I had to ask myself, like, what was the motivation for this in the first place? Because I'm not even really enjoying it. So that's kind of how I got into studying health. And then, kind of why this particular area that we're talking about today is so close to my own heart. I'm just so passionate about people, entrepreneurs, people who are mission and purpose driven, really experiencing the joy and pleasure of that journey.
Well, and I feel like it is such a common feature of people who go into healthcare on any level that they had their own personal reckoning with respect to health. And seems to be this transitional point where health went from being something that was abdicated to someone else to something that you truly had as ownership for yourself. And I love the way that you put that it's an opportunity to feel the pleasure and the joy and the empowerment of actually being able to take care of yourself. I think that's such a great starting point for this whole conversation. And part of your message is that when you get control of your digestive health, you get control of your hormones, like women can be unstoppable.
Absolutely. And we need that in the world today. I mean, I know that you're passionate about this as well, but, on a more philosophical level, I just see we're in the era of women uprising again, or another era of that in the world, which is desperately needed. We need that, in Chinese medicine, we would call it the balance between the yin and the yang energies in the world. But women are so unstoppable and powerful, and especially when they're, in balance and feeling great, it's just exponential what we can accomplish.
And so let's talk about that, because I feel like for a lot of people, the notion of health is they view it as something that happens to other people, but not necessarily them. Or they really believe that they're healthy because they're not on medication, or they don't have to take anything. How do you define health? Like, what is the baseline for you that you want people executing from? Like, you're talking about women changing the world. So we're not talking about simply the absence of disease. We're definitely more evolved than that.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that you said that, because it really is, when I think about this, to me, health is defined by basically waking up every morning, feeling energized and passionate and ready to charge the day, and having a body that can sustain and carry us through, what we need to do that, to make that world happen. I think what winds up happening is that so often we override that, really, this concept of, so especially when it comes to entrepreneurs, and I think this is true for women who are passionate about their careers as well and, aren't running their own business, we have this vision that we see that we want to create. And it's a vision of what our life and work will look like and the result of that, whether it's for, how it's going to benefit others, how it's going to feel to us. And we're basically elevating our life into that vision. And all of that is based on this idea of how we want to feel, right? We imagine how it's going to feel when we achieve those goals, the small goals, the big successes we reach. And so I think for everybody that I know who is in business for themselves, when you're trying to commit to playing full out, what it means is that you have to have the energy to go out into the world and do that and serve that purpose that we're here to serve for ourselves and our families and the world. And I think a lot of people, when we hear that concept, like I have to have the energy, we think like, okay, down another latte or, another matcha latte or whatever, or get into workaholic mode and really like push harder, push. And if we do that at the exclusion of our body's needs, we can, actually have the opposite effect and drive ourselves into the ground. And what winds up happening is that, we get so far away from that original vision and passion of, why are we doing this in the first place? Because we don't have the vitality we need to really live in, that zone of our creative genius as much of the time as possible so that we can, make the biggest contribution to the world that we can. But, as importantly, so that we, going back to that concept of enjoying the journey, so that we can actually feel the success and the pleasure of having, built what we've built and accomplished what we accomplished.
Right. And there's this classic adage, right, that you expend your health to be able to achieve your dreams, and then you get your dream income and your dream life, and then you're suddenly spending all of the things you just earned to be able to gain back your health. And I think both of us would espouse to the idea that you don't have to give it up to be able to have the other. And so I love that in working with women, and we're going to talk about burnout in a few minutes, but I actually want to talk about the areas that you focus on in your practice, which are not two divergent niches. They're actually two very complementary systems, and that is digestive health and hormones. There's a lot of people talking about hormones out there, and there's a lot of people talking about digestive health. And as a clinician, I get why those two are connected. But can you talk about that with people? Why digestive health and hormones are just such critical, fundamental pieces for women's overall health success?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. So right now the gut is having a moment, right? Like microbiome and gut function. And I love that that's happening in the world because, so much comes down to not just the nutrients we digest and absorb, but also who are our tenants, right? Our gut is like this apartment building, and there's somewhat a limited amount of space. And so we want to have all, good, friendly, hospitable tenants that are doing things for us. And those little gut bugs, they do so many things. If you, just read the news every day, we hear something new every day about how, good bugs protect us from disease processes like cancer or diabetes. They can modulate our body fat composition, and they are, if they go off, they can be linked to things like depression and anxiety and how we feel, right? Our mood and brain, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's endless, just the way that we're starting to see that the bacteria that live, the flora that live in our gut impact every one of our body functions and nudge it in the direction of health or nudge it in the direction of disease. So essentially, I love looking at the intersection of how hormones impact that. And so there's a whole host of ways. And I think the simplest way to talk about this, because there's definitely ways that when we talk about hormones, like you said, Megan, they're broad, right? There's things like reproductive hormones, right? Like what we think about female hormones, estrogen, progesterone, all that. But then there's this kind of upstream almost from that is what we call our stress hormones, our adrenal hormones. And so really that's the part that I see going off in this group of, women who are entrepreneurs, right? We're often balancing our family, our marriages or relationships, our professional lives, and then we're trying to stay active and healthy and look good and wear all of those hats at once, right? What happens is that so often that stress hormone cascade, also known as the HPA axis or adrenal hormones, gets out of balance. I just want to clarify because there's a lot of talk out there about, adrenal fatigue and what it is or it isn't. So I'll just start by saying that, when we're talking about the adrenal hormones, we're not, and getting out of balance, we're not talking about that there's a disease of the adrenal glands. Like there's nothing wrong with the glands. What we're talking about isn't a hardware problem. I think of it as a software problem. So essentially the software being that dialogue that's happening between your brain and your adrenal glands. And so what people start to notice first is things like fatigue or a feeling of anxiety or just lack of motivation or having a harder time with follow through on tasks they're trying to accomplish. So we get less done with more effort. Having less bandwidth for stress or things that occur that are unplanned in our lives, maybe sleep disruptions or insomnia, or waking up all of a sudden at 3 a.m. with your mind just, totally alert and ready to roll. And there can also be an inflammatory component where we get pain, muscular or joint pain, or we have poor recovery from workouts, or skin issues that are inflammatory can pop up, like eczema, psoriasis, or acne. There's also female hormone symptoms that can get worse. Women start missing their periods or having cycle timing issues or noticing their PMS is getting worse. I actually had a woman recently tell me that this was making her less competitive in the workplace. So we'll get into the female hormone part later.
I've heard that bullshit too. And right? I stop in my tracks when I hear that. I'm not meaning to digress, but I am going to for 1 second.
Do it.
And I had this woman come in, and she's had a host of issues, had been on the birth control pill continuously without interruption for like 3 years. And I said, well, let's talk about the connection between those two pieces. And she's like, I don't want to get my period anymore at work because this is now my competitive advantage over other women. I am now more like the men. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like we just had a lot of limiting beliefs to unpack right there. But I mean, it's a huge issue. Women hate their periods.
That breaks my heart.
Yeah, it totally broke mine. I deep breathed my way through that moment.
Yeah. I mean, big love to her, for sure, for having the bravery to just say that and share it. And that's her perspective. And that, at this moment. And, I feel like, gosh, that's like, we could go down a whole conversation about that too. So yeah, I mean, I know you and I both hear those things, and it's sad because really it's our unfair advantage. It's our biggest strength, right? Having that intuition and those moments of fluctuation that change over time, like that's necessary. It's essential for us to solve the problems of the world that we're facing right now.
But a lot of women hate, and I'll use that word, they hate their period because for so many reasons. Culturally, it is something that has not traditionally, the culturescape has not traditionally honored it. But for a lot of women, it's so uncomfortable and problematic for them that is the emotion that's elicited when they talk about that. Can we talk about not just the fact that when those things are happening, things are dysregulated, but can we go into that a little bit in terms of, first of all, it's common, but it's not normal. Where do you start when those people walk through your door?
Okay. Yeah. And so this ties back to, I'm sorry, I was really long-winded there and never got back to the connection between those hormones in the gut, but it actually all ties in together. So essentially, I sit down and we talk physiology, but we also have to have this come to truth moment that's like, okay, so, what is the all that you're doing and what is the all that you want to be doing? And also what was going on in your life before this changed, right? Like you didn't used to have these symptoms. You didn't used to struggle in this way. It didn't used to be this bad. What was going on right prior to that, or in the year prior, 2 years prior? And it is astonishing. I'm sure you see this too, but how so many people don't make a connection between, I'll hear things like, oh, well, I was in grad school while training for a marathon, and I was also working a part-time job, and then I went through a really bad breakup, right? And it's like, oh my God, that like the amount of stress they were under, or they lost a loved one, right? Somebody passed away, or maybe they, had a kid and then a second kid and were running their own business, and bought a house. So people just, because we're capable, and especially women, right? We just like do it. We just make it happen, right? Whatever needs to happen, we do it. But I think especially culturally, we expect that to be normal. And so often people don't connect going through those periods of either, trauma, capital T, or trauma, little t, lowercase t, the big and the small stresses, with the fact that sometime soon after that, things changed in their physiology. And that's the first conversation I have, is just kind of connecting those dots. Can I talk about like what's actually happening, the physiology of that?
Yes, 100%. Because this is what people are missing, right? Is they're missing, well, why is that happening? What is going on behind the scenes?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with going back to this concept of adrenal hormones. So, what are your adrenal glands? Just for starters, there are these two tiny little glands that are shaped kind of like pyramids, and there's one on top of each of your kidneys. And they produce a whole ton of different hormones. But among the hormones they produce, some of the most important are your stress hormones, or stress. I like to think of these as stress response hormones. So most notably cortisol, which everyone will have heard of, and then another hormone called DHEA. And cortisol is a really, really versatile hormone. So it has a bunch of roles, right? Besides being the one that deals with, hey, I think I'm in a stressful situation and we need to mobilize resources to, either really this comes down to that fight or flight, right? Like sending blood to the muscles and increasing circulation and increasing our breathing rate and oxygen, literally to deal with something that's a stress or a threat to our survival. Cortisol also does some other things. So one of the things that it does is it helps to regulate our blood sugar along with insulin. And then it also acts like our natural anti-inflammatory hormone or in the body because it's closely related to something called cortisone, which is like our natural prednisone, right? Like, so people have heard of, using cortisone cream on a skin or in an injection. Well, this is basically our body's natural version of that. And it's also our hormone of energy and alertness. So we make some of that cortisol all day. It's not like it only happens when we're stressed. We pump out a bunch of it in the morning when we first open our eyes and see bright light. And then it gradually tapers throughout the day and should be the lowest at bedtime, which allows us to ease back into sleep and then start the whole process over again. What happens is that outside of that daily rhythm, we release extra cortisol in response to anything that we consider to be stressful. And that starts with a perception in the brain. So if I have a work deadline or if my girls who are like launching their summit or their book or their new website, or if you got in an argument with your partner before work, all of those things your body perceives as stressful. And then it stimulates this chain reaction down through our hormonal cascades and our sympathetic nervous system. So we release adrenaline, and then that stimulates release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. And the purpose is to help us survive or thrive given the situation. This is natural. And if it happens once in a while, that's okay, but we're not designed to withstand the effects of chronic stress or the perception of chronic stress. Most of our existence on the planet was pretty mundane for our species. We built shelter, we hunted or gathered food, we, did things with our communities. We had a lot of free time, and only rarely did we have emergencies, right? And they were pretty profound. They were usually life or death situations. But today's world that we've created doesn't really work like that. We have just ongoing excess workload, we undersleep, we have artificial light, we have social media, over or under exercising, all of these things. And that causes our brain to constantly be signaling, hey, we need more of this cortisol release. So ultimately what happens is that when we have too much of that hormone around, or when our body starts to downregulate, because actually having too much cortisol around can be toxic in the body, and our body knows that. And so eventually we'll sometimes start to underproduce cortisol as well. And I think of this as kind of like the Goldilocks hormone or baby bear hormone. You want it, not too high, not too low, just right,
It's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So if we have over or under production, or if the timing is off, like it's high when it should be low and low when it should be high, that's when we become a hot mess. And so the biggest thing is that, we'll feel either like fatigue or overstimulation and anxiety, or maybe our sleep gets off. Those are some big signs. But then it's the downstream stuff that gets really juicy and interesting, because this is impacting our whole body. Okay, so here's what happens in the gut is that one of the things cortisol does is it really modulates a bunch of functions in the digestive tract, one of which is, how much we secrete things like enzymes and stomach acid and all of these secretions that are necessary to like properly digest our food. So those get impacted, and also the motility of the gut, which are the rhythmic waves of contraction that literally move food down through the intestines, so it can be digested and absorbed. And when the reason that gets messed up or put on hold is because our body is essentially always kind of weighing the pros and cons of where to put its energy and resources. And if your body thinks you're under an immediate stress, it's going to prioritize survival of you now over things like digesting and absorbing nutrients, which can, in its perception, happen tomorrow. So your digestion kind of gets put on hold. And more importantly, your immune system gets suppressed. So there's something called secretory IgA that we make at all of the mucosal barriers of our body. So we make it, all through the gut is the kind of area where we make the most of this. But we also make it in the lungs and the sinus, the urinary tract, the, reproductive tract, all of the places we have mucous membranes. And this is like our first defense. It's like the bouncers at the entry points to our body. And as long as those immune agents are strong, we have good defenses. But when our body perceives that, we have to kind of like run from the tiger right now, it thinks that immune system is something that can get put on hold till tomorrow, and we become more vulnerable. And this is when people will start to notice that maybe they're catching more colds and flus, like they seem to be susceptible to inflammation. Well, in the gut, sometimes we don't even notice right away when this happens, but this is when we get more susceptible to infections and all the things that are hot topics right now. So things like having candida or fungal overgrowth, having small intestine bacterial overgrowth start to occur, having catching a parasite, right? We're exposed to organisms all the time. Like if you eat organic vegetables and don't sterilize them every time you eat them, then basically you're going to get exposed to organisms and parasites and pathogens that are like, on your kale. But we don't always get sick from that just because we are exposed, because we have these defense mechanisms that allow these things to pass through us and we fend them off. When those defense mechanisms get low, that's when these things are opportunistic and they can kind of, take hold and colonize. And that's when we start to get problems. And this is one of the reasons why I'll see so many times, like all my people with, IBS or other digestive issues, guarantee that often right before the onset or worsening of those, they went through some period of increased stress in their lives.
Yeah, the stress connection is so critical for people to understand it. And I think what we're both will acknowledge is you're not going to escape from stress. You're not going to be able to step away from it, but it's how you manage it and it's how you buffer that stress that makes a difference. And the thing I talk about with my patients, and I'm sure you say something similar, is stress is not just the mental, emotional things that you deal with on any given day. Stress is also poorly managed blood sugar. It's poor quality food. It's living in a crappy air environment. So if you're blowing your stress budget on all of this, crappy things that don't matter and don't add back into your life, then when you have emotional stresses, you have less physiological resistance. And so these things bubble up sooner.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Megan, that blood sugar piece, that is so important. Like kind of along the lines of what you asked with what's the conversation you have with these women when they come in, I would say that, of course, there's the place for running testing and, rebalancing all those things. But like the eating for balanced blood sugar is so huge. And almost, I want to say, it's important for everybody, but it's almost more important for women just because of all of the ways our hormones cycle and how all of those things interact. And if your blood sugar gets off or goes low, which, how many of us at some point in our life or another have like grabbed a coffee on the way out the door or something like that, and then not eaten for 5 hours, right? And especially today with like how popular it is, like bulletproof coffee and intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets, I think all of those, I'll just caveat, I'll say each of those has its place and can be extremely useful tools. I use them in my practice with people all the time, but it's in who and when, right? So if someone's hormonally fragile, those diets that actually can have like a lot of health benefits can actually be the thing that is crashing someone's hormones. Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely. And I want to be clear for women, like, don't kid yourself on this. If you skip your lunch because you're super busy at work and you're running around like a crazy person, don't call it intermittent fasting. Like that's not what you're doing. You're skipping that meal and you're not taking time to honor and nourish yourself appropriately. So, intermittent fasting and ketogenic diet, I call these advanced maneuvers. And you can't go there until you've got the hormonal piece under control and the digestive health under control. Otherwise, it's just one more stress on your body. But absolutely, the blood sugar management is so key. It's so critical. And when we get into martyr mode, which we do as women, managing blood sugar and just going without food is one of the first things and most pervasive habits that I certainly see. And we've just got to stop it. We got to carry around a good bar in our bag. Like, you just have to interrupt that bad habit because it's not okay. It's not okay for you. It will not put you at your best.
Yeah. I see that, just one more thing on that, like some of them, like to really ground it into what people experience is I see hypoglycemic tendencies as one of the leading causes of panic attacks or anxiety attacks, and also of insomnia, like frequent waking type insomnia. And sometimes you can be working with someone, and if you just get them to stabilize their blood sugar through the day by either eating a little more frequently or looking at the composition of the meals they're eating, right? The things that we do. I notice that you can, cut that at least in half or sometimes wipe it out altogether, where all of a sudden someone's like, oh yeah, I don't remember the last time I had a panic attack, or I actually have been sleeping through the night now, just from balancing blood sugar without doing anything else.
Yeah, it's one of those foundational pieces that just has to be in place. And I think it's part of basic health literacy. You just have to know how to do that for yourself. And how I do it for me and how you do it for you is probably going to be different than how other listeners do it. But you've got to take responsibility for that part of self-nourishment. Otherwise, you're never going to advance as it pertains to your health.
Absolutely.
When you talk about digestive health for people, because I think we would both agree you can't regulate hormones unless digestive health is dialed in. What are some of the musts that you insist that people put into place with respect to their overall digestive health?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that, there's some kind of make it or break it rules. So one thing would be like, and this is so relevant for those of us that are, running our own businesses, like when you eat, stop and eat, not like eating in front of the computer, eating in front of like on the phone call in your meeting while you're multitasking, but actually like pausing, taking a deep breath. You don't have to like get too fancy about it, but just take a breath and then like eat your food and chew it and actually spend time doing that. And if possible, if you're somewhere where it's warm enough to be outside right now, or, when it is, I think like getting outside, breathing fresh air while doing that is even like taking it up a notch, but just removing yourself from the work environment in order to, and why? Because that helps us drop into a parasympathetic mode, which is the opposite of that fight or flight. So we think of it as like rest and digest. And essentially, if we're in go mode, we're not going to digest our nutrients. So that's like just step one, right? Is chew your food and take time to eat it.
And I'm just going to add, for those of you who are in cold places, and I'm in a cold place right now, we have the clothing to be able to deal with the cold weather. So I would say go outside regardless, like actually engage in nature every day.
There you go. I love that. It's so funny because I grew up on the East Coast where it was definitely cold winters. And I left as soon as I could, mostly because of the weather. I have to, kind of ashamedly admit, I think I'm designed my family is from a lot of places, but one of them is from North Africa. And my physiology, I just like feel so much better when I'm in the tropics. So I'm picturing myself putting on a parka and going outside in the snow to like eat my lunch and just laughing.
Yes, you don't have to eat your lunch outside, but just go walk around the block.
Yeah,
we had a massive snowstorm here in Toronto last week, and my husband was away, and I had this big driveway I had to shovel in. And then, you know what? It was awesome. I dressed for it, and there was snow blowing past me, and there was something kind of like primal and raw and awesome about it. So I think we forget how powerful nature is when you just stand in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So other things are to, about the digestion is, not to drink a ton of fluids while we're trying to eat our meal. We definitely want to hydrate, but we just we want the timing to be a little spaced out. This is just so we don't like water down our digestive secretions, basically. Some people that's when they drink their water, or that's when they drink their fluid. And then outside of that, just generally healthy tips for wellness and food, or, try to eat as much whole food and, unprocessed and organic if possible when you can. Those things, believe it or not, do play a big role on your digestion. And then, of course, doing things like bonus level is like try to include some fermented foods. That's always helpful as well. But those are kind of some generally good starting places. And then, of course, when we're talking about someone who has actual, digestive symptoms, it really depends on the individual. There's so many paths we could go down around food and, what to do and what not to do that can help each individual. But those are generally helpful for everyone.
What are your favorite fermented foods?
I'm a big fan of sauerkraut. It's so simple, so cheap. Everyone can make it. It's pretty hard to mess it up. So I love sauerkraut. But right now I've been on the fermented coconut water kefir, the little they come in like a small beverage bottle. I can get them at my local market anyway. And I am just in love with that stuff. It's so tasty. It's not like hyper sweetened or anything. There's people who love kombucha, and I'm not one of those people because I find it to be so super sweet. And also because I'm a little bit wary of, there's a couple of reasons I'm a little wary of too much kombucha. Traditionally, it wasn't consumed in the kind of quantities that we're seeing now. And it has penicillin-like strains in it that can actually kill off some of our good bacteria. And also because it's a conglomerate, like the culture includes bacteria and fungi and other organisms, there's yeast in there too. And so for anyone who has a candida problem or a yeast problem or mold problem, it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. So not anti-kombucha, but it's not one of the ones I do every day or anything like that.
All the time. Yeah. And I think that's fair. And it's like that with everything, right? Like things become trends, and it just doesn't mean that's the only thing you eat. Variability at the end of the day is such an important step and tenet in good health.
Absolutely.
I think this is a really what we've done is we've made these really powerful connections, and then we've talked about actionable items, like things that people need to be aware of. And I know where we started, we were looking at burnout and how these things are implicated. But the reality is that our resilience to burnout is going to be so much stronger when we take care of these foundational pieces and address these fundamentals. And a huge theme of our podcast lately have been, what do you need to take responsibility for in your own life to take your business or your ambition or your family or whatever it happens to be to the next level? And I love that you've just provided these really strong foundational pieces for people to be able to do that. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. I agree with you. I think of, I'm always telling the people I work with that your physical wellness is kind of the bandwidth or the platform for your emotional and professional and ultimately, I think, spiritual too, growth and development and well-being. And I really do see it that way. And I think you're right. Like these foundational pieces, especially hormones and gut health, are so important for maintaining that. And that's, like you said, I love how you said that we can really just take responsibility for those, because these are, even though we can get abstract with like all the minutia of the hormones and what's happening, taking care of these things comes down to these like lifestyle things that we can choose for ourselves every day.
Yeah, and they absolutely are choices. Brie, how would you define health?
Well, it's definitely not something that's static. I think of it as shifting, and I really think, on the simplest level, I think of health as, I kind of mentioned this before, but just waking up with a good amount of energy, feeling happy and excited to be alive through the day. And then, having your head hit the pillow and you go to bed, and having, these body systems be in a relative but dynamic balance through all the stages of our life. I think on the most simplest level, that's how I consider health.
I love that. That's beautiful. Hey, fellow go-getters. So we've got a lot going on right now over at Entrepology Performance Labs, and I want to make sure that you guys are in the loop. We have groups and contests and quizzes and meal plans and all sorts of things that you can get your hands on. And the best place for you to be in the know is actually to ensure that you are following and hanging out and engaging over on the gram. My personal handle, which is at Dr. that is Dr. Megan Walker, is where most of this activity is currently taking place. And so I'm going to invite all of you to come on over and to follow and to play along. This way you can engage with our weekly guests, get direct links to some of the things that they're talking about in our show notes, and have access to some of the coolest new quizzes, ideas, and games and links that we have in the pipeline over at Entrepology. Head on over to Instagram, hit follow, and let's keep in touch. My handle over there is at Dr. Megan Walker, and let's keep the conversation happening. I call this part of the interview our KPIs, so key performance indicators. So just like we have them in our businesses, I believe that we have them in how we live our lives as well. So I've got a few rapid fire questions, if you will indulge me with throwing them your way.
All right, bring it. Let's
Okay,
do it.
here we go. Number one, who is inspiring you right now?
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Man, that woman's on fire. She is just like my hero right now. I think of her as like the kind of next generation Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And, I have a strong activist and social justice streak in me. And I just love what a kind of unsuspecting underdog she is, although she's not an underdog in the least. She's such a powerhouse. She just, came out of nowhere. She's like, breaks all of the norms and the perceptions of what we have as leaders, especially in politics. She's this, she's that, she's young, she's from this neighborhood, she's of this, background or ethnicity, like all the things. And she is just so eloquent and so on point every time that I hear her, speak to anything, especially, when she's like challenging the norm. I think she's brilliant.
Yeah, such a great example. What is your audacious goal for the next year?
My audacious goal, well, what I haven't shared so far in our conversation is that I'm actually just about 6 months pregnant.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm super excited about that. I just turned 40 this year in January, and I feel better than I've ever felt in my life. I'm so excited, looking forward to what my 40s are going to be. And this new baby on the way is going to be a huge part of that reality. And so my audacious goal is just to keep loving the work I do. And my team, I have an awesome team of practitioners and support players who make up our online virtual clinic. And I'm so excited to, be inducted into the fold of mamas who are also in business.
Oh, I have to tell you, it is a blast. And it's one of the most productive things you'll do for your business.
I bet.
Because you are hyper-focused. Oh, that's so exciting.
Yeah.
My pleasure. What is the one thing you are most consistent with respect to your health?
Movement. And why I say that is I would say that like nutrition and sleep are up there too. But I believe that, everything in moderation, including moderation in moderation. So if I'm really candid about this, like I do eat like a really whole foods, high plant-based diet that also does include animal proteins, and, is primarily organic. But there are definitely times when like, I'll go out to eat at a restaurant and I'm like, that looks delicious. I'm going to eat it. And, I'm not thinking about, was it made with organic ingredients or not? So that happens. And I think that, that falls into that kind of 80-20, or I think of it as a 90-10 rule. What we do 80 to 90% of the time is what makes or breaks our health. But movement is one of the kind of categories. I think of it as, food, sleep, nutrition, and then our relationship with nature, like being in touch with nature. Those are kind of like these 4 components of health that I think of are really important. And so movement is the one that for me is kind of like, it's just like a deal breaker. I have to. I was sharing with you that before I met you for this call, I went and worked out. I went and did a bar class, was what I did this morning. But I'm a dancer. Not only is movement so important just for actual physical health, and I noticed that like how well I feel depends on if I've moved my body or not, and how well my brain functions and how well I sleep and my mood. But it's actually like a spiritual practice for me. It's like it's a meditation. It's what I do that when I'm doing it, it's only about that, and I'm not thinking about the rest of the world or the rest of my day. And so it's just kind of an essential for me to be on point and do all the things that I have to do.
I really love that. I'm going to say I'm not a dancer. I really love to dance, but I'm not a dancer. But I can see that. Like knowing how to move your body is such a powerful tool, but the exercise piece, 100%. So key and so critical. Besides building a human being, what is something totally badass about you that people would not otherwise know?
Oh, geez. Totally badass. Well, okay. I guess this kind of goes along with the dance thing. Like, one of the types of dance that I really love is samba dance, which is from Brazil. And there's a lot of different kinds of samba, but in some of the times in my life, I've done what's called batucada or samba, what people think of as samba, which is the big feathers, like carnival kind of costumes, bright colors and sequins and rhinestones. So there's this part of me that's like this like geeky clinician digging into the science and the literature and research. And then there's this other part of me that has like been on stage in front of 2,000 people, like shaking it in like a very sparkly bikini.
That is amazing. Good for you.
Yeah.
What do you do for fun or play?
Oh, so many things. Play is so important. Mm-hmm. Gosh, it's so important. So my husband and I will often go, we live in this really beautiful part of the world, in Santa Cruz. And so I spend a lot of time, we live about a mile from the ocean. So I'll spend a lot of time just like outside near the beach or the ocean, going for walks. There's beautiful hiking in this area and mountain biking. Again, lots of dance. I have this really amazing community of people here who are all like, 40, 50, 60 years old and still really involved in their communities and really active in the sense of like dance and music and art and things like that. So we do a lot of playing together in community, performing or just doing those kind of things together.
You're making me want to move to an ocean.
Well, come visit.
I know.
I like it.
I know. I'm heading to San Diego in a week. I'm looking forward to it. What is your favorite color?
I have two that are equally tied, and it depends what day. So one of them is like aqua, like the turquoise aqua color of the ocean in like the Caribbean, and the other one is this terracotta coral color. It's just like so feminine, and it's kind of like a little bit fiery and a little bit soft, and that color just does it for me.
Amazing. And last question for you, Brie, entrepreneurism. Are we born this way or do we learn to become entrepreneurs?
Both. So, probably like yourself, I went to school to learn what I thought was to learn to help people. And I considered myself an accidental entrepreneur because the field I went into was not particularly employable at the time that I graduated, although there's lots of jobs now, to go work in other people's clinics. I didn't learn those business skills. I learned them along the way by accident as I went stumbling, which is, here's my little PSA for entrepreneurs is if you haven't already, get a business coach, because unless you went to school for business and marketing, you can save yourself so much stress and struggle to just get a little help from someone who has. So I wish I had done that earlier. But anyway, what I realized later was once I had actually learned some of this stuff that like, I am by nature somebody who I love working with a team, but like I love being in charge and I have ideas and visions about where I want things to go. And I've never really been an employee very often in my life. So when I actually like sat back and looked at that, I was like, oh yeah, maybe I was just born this way. So I think it's a little both.
Yeah, I love that. And I see that. And I hear that from you. Brie, I know people are going to want to follow up with you. Where can we send them to learn more about what you're doing?
Well, a couple of places. So I'm really active on Instagram, and my account is just my name, Brie Wieselman. And so I love hanging out and chatting with my followers, and people ask me questions on there. And I'm always trying to put out some, great information for people to help them on their health journeys. And then my website, which is also briewieselman.com, is another great place for things that you won't see on social media, things like blog posts and updates and recipes and ways to get in direct contact with me.
Fantastic. Brie, thanks so much for spending some time with us today. This was an awesome conversation.
Thank you. This was a blast. I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed our conversation and would like to hear more, head on over to Stitcher or iTunes and subscribe to the Entrepology podcast. We would also really appreciate a quick review. When people have their health, they can change the world. Let us keep you healthy and you go change the world.